All right, welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving straight into a massive, enduring myth, the idea that wartime government spending actually creates prosperity. We're going to uncover the real foundation of post-World War II economic growth. And let me tell you, it's a story full of dramatic pivots, staggering numbers, and a fundamental misunderstanding that still dictates how we view our economy and your purchasing power right now.
So let's just get right into it. We've all heard the classic textbook narrative, right? The stock market crashed in 1929, the Great Depression set in, and while the New Deal threw absolutely everything at the wall, public works, new agencies, you name it, it was ultimately the massive industrial mobilization of World War II that finally saved the day. The story goes that the war ended the Depression. But today, we're going to put that exact theory to the test.
To really grasp the scale of what happened, we've got to look at the timeline. 10 whole years after the devastating 1929 crash, unemployment was still stubbornly stuck at around 15% by 1939. The job was far from finished. But then, suddenly, Pearl Harbor happened. The U.S. entered the war, and almost overnight, the entire landscape flipped. Dust-gathering factories roared back to life, but they weren't building tractors or family cars anymore. They were building tanks and bombers. A staggering 17 million new jobs appeared seemingly out of thin air.
The macroeconomic shift here was just wild. Defense spending rocketed from a tiny 1.4% of GDP before the war to over 37% at its peak. Unemployment literally plummeted to below 2%. Families who hadn't seen a steady paycheck in a decade were suddenly earning really good money. On paper, the American economy looked virtually unstoppable.
Keynesian economists at the time took one look at that soaring GDP and that near-zero unemployment and said, aha, here is the ultimate proof. When the private sector stops spending, the government just spends for them, and boom, prosperity. But we need to contrast that macro illusion with the grim reality on the ground. Think about a guy like Jeff, living with his family in 1944 Ohio. The newspaper says they've never been richer, but sitting at their kitchen table, they're totally out of sugar coupons, and their meat allocation was just cut to 2 pounds for the whole family for an entire week. Americans were living under some of the strictest rationing in history. Gasoline, coffee, cheese, even shoes were controlled, and car production completely banned since 1942.
And that brings us to a crucial point. This whole wartime boom was, in many ways, a statistical illusion. Sure, Americans were saving 25% of their income, but not because they suddenly became these brilliant budgeters. It was because there was literally nothing to buy. You see, GDP is just a calculation. It goes up by the exact same $10 million whether a private company builds a neighborhood of family homes or the government builds a bomb and drops it into the middle of the ocean. It's the exact same number on a spreadsheet, but a drastically different reality for the people living through it. Workers were making more money than ever, but actually eating less than when they were broke.
Well, the ultimate test of this government spending equals prosperity theory finally arrived in 1945. The war ends, the guns go quiet, 10 million soldiers are returning home, about to flood the job market. And at the exact same time, government spending is scheduled to drop by over 60%. Economic experts were terrified. Prominent voices, like Professor Sampson here, boldly predicted that without that massive government spending, America would face an epidemic of violence and the greatest period of unemployment in history. Even President Truman agreed that a catastrophic wave of mass unemployment was basically a sure thing.
So what was the reality? 3.9%. Everyone completely agreed that without wartime spending, America would crash, and they were 100% wrong. Bomb factories seamlessly transitioned into appliance factories. Over 20 million people were released from war-related work, and yet, instead of a massive depression, unemployment peaked at just 3.9%. President Truman himself later called it the swiftest and most gigantic changeover from war to peace any nation had ever made.
The economy didn't just survive those massive spending cuts, it thrived because of them. Resources that had been trapped inside the war machine were finally flowing back into making things that regular people actually wanted and needed. The Keynesian prediction of a post-war crash was tested in real time, and it completely fell apart. But textbooks rarely updated this fact. Which leaves us with one massive lingering question. If dropping bombs and running up government deficits didn't actually cure the economy, what did?
To understand the cure, we actually have to rewind to where the economic disease first started, all the way back in 1914 with World War I.
Mobilizing millions of soldiers across continents costs a staggering amount of money, so when tax revenues ran dry, governments just turned to the printing press. To do this, they had to ditch the gold standard, which previously forced every dollar or franc to be backed by physical gold. And even after WWII ended, the printing didn't stop. Countries engaged in this disastrous race to the bottom, constantly devaluing their own currencies just to make their exports cheaper than their neighbors.
And the consequences of this unchecked printing? Absolutely devastating. Germany printed money so aggressively that their currency became entirely worthless. We're talking 200 billion marks for a single loaf of bread. Imagine being a housewife in Berlin, having to literally load up a wheelbarrow full of your life savings in cash just to go buy your weekly groceries. It's almost unimaginable.
As every country destroyed its own currency to steal trade from its neighbors, global trust completely evaporated. Between 1929 and 1934, world trade collapsed by an astonishing 66%. Populations were left starving, humiliated, and convinced the whole system was rigged and broken. And sadly, this economic despair paved a direct path for desperate citizens to turn to totalitarians standing on podiums promising to fix everything, like Hitler in Germany and Mussolini in Italy. The path from the printing press to the battlefield was terrifyingly short.
Recognizing that broken money leads directly to broken nations, delegates from 44 countries got together in 1944 at a giant hotel in New Hampshire to figure out a fix. What they came up with was an offensively boring but absolutely essential solution known as the Bretton Woods system. It was entirely designed to restore trust to a world economy that had been completely shattered by war and inflation.
The mechanics of this were crucial. They essentially created a hard limit on the printing presses, using a two-step anchor. Step 1. Every global currency gets pegged to the US dollar. Step 2. The US dollar gets strictly anchored to gold at exactly $35 an ounce. This meant governments could no longer just turn their currency into confetti to temporarily boost their exports. For the first time in decades, money actually meant something again.
And this stable foundation was the real cause of the post-war miracle. Take a citizen like Friedrich in post-war Germany. His city is rubble, his machine shop is half destroyed. But because politicians could no longer casually print money, the cash in Friedrich's pocket was tied to a system he could actually trust. He could safely take out a loan, rebuild, and hire people. Multiply Friedrich by millions, and you get an absolute economic miracle. Countries flattened by war, like Germany, Japan, France, came roaring back, not because of wartime spending, but because they finally had stable, anchored money.
But as the source analysis shows, the Bretton Woods system had one fatal flaw. It required everyone to trust the US dollar as the peg. Who watches America, right? For a while, the US behaved, but then came the 1960s. America fired up the printing presses to simultaneously fund the Vietnam War overseas and expand the domestic welfare state at home through Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. To pay for both, America just flooded the world with printed dollars. The glaring problem? The physical gold sitting in Fort Knox wasn't growing to match all that new paper.
Other nations definitely noticed this discrepancy, and one man in particular called it out, French President Charles de Gaulle. He realized that holding these newly printed dollars meant France's wealth was actively being diluted by America's inflation. De Gaulle bluntly called this arrangement robbery with better tailoring. Refusing to be the one left empty-handed at the back of the line, in 1965 he literally sent ships and planes to America to return their dollars and withdraw France's physical gold.
The stark mathematical reality here became undeniable. By 1966, the United States was facing a full-blown bank run. America held only $3.2 billion in gold reserves, but they owed $14 billion in foreign claims. The math simply did not work. Other countries, like West Germany, started getting the exact same idea as France. By 1971, Britain stepped up and formally requested $3 billion in gold.
Cornered by nations demanding the gold they were rightfully owed, President Richard Nixon had to act. In August 1971, after a secret meeting at Camp David, Nixon interrupted television broadcasts to deliver an absolute shock to the world. Effective immediately, he completely severed the dollar's anchor to gold. He assured the American people it was just a temporary measure, one that of course has miraculously lasted up to this very day. The anchor was gone, global currencies were now backed by absolutely nothing but a government's promise not to print too much.
So, how did relying on government promises go? Well, stripped of its strict Bretton Woods anchor, the price of gold didn't just creep up, it skyrocketed. From that fixed rate of $35 an ounce, gold is projected to hit over $5,000 by 2026.
The true value of the paper dollar was revealed as it plummeted against hard assets.
According to the sources, without the hard stop of the gold standard, we entered an entirely new era. Within 2 years of Nixon's move, inflation surged, growth stalled, and economists literally had to invent a new word, stagflation. From the 1970s oil crisis to the savings and loan crisis, the dot-com bust, and the 2008 financial crisis, every single decade brought another major mess. And without the gold constraint, the solution to every single one of those messes simply became print more money.
Which brings us completely full circle. The source material argues that the myth of World War II spending creating prosperity survives today because, frankly, it is incredibly useful. If we believe that government deficits and war spending cure economies, then printing endless amounts of money sounds necessary rather than destructive. But as this analysis suggests, every crisis just becomes an excuse to do more of the very thing that caused the instability in the first place. So, I'll leave you with this chilling warning to seriously reflect on. There is no subtler, no surer means of overturning the existing basis of society than to debauch the currency. Next time you hear about an economic miracle driven by the printing press, you have to ask yourself, who is actually paying the price?